So let's get to your third question. What's the next thing you want to know?
So let's say you were starting from scratch, right? You got nothing, right? No followers, nothing, no podcast, no newsletter. Today, how would you approach what you're doing now just from scratch? What platform would you choose? Where would you go to build that audience just right now in today's age?
Well, first of all, we'll put a link in the show notes. I don't remember what episode it was, but there's an episode where I talked about basically how I'd build a $100,000 a year business from scratch. So that relates to some of this, that if you're interested, people can go check out. I'm going to talk about, because I knew we were going to be talking about sort of new creators and like where to start and what to do, kind of what you're getting at. And I literally challenged myself and I jotted down a list. I was like, all right, if someone is like a new creator and they're like, what the hell do I do? I was like, I'm just going to write down 10, just literally like off the top of my head. What are the first 10 things that I would tell them to do? And I tried to make this sort of universal because maybe they're doing a podcast, maybe they're doing a newsletter, maybe they're doing whatever it is that they're doing. So it's not necessarily specific to that. But here are the 10 sort of tips or advice I have for new creators. So number one, and this is by far the most important, is you need to get clear on who you want to help, what you want to help them do, and what transformation you want to help them make. A lot of people are creating content and trying to grow audiences, and they don't really know the answer to that. They don't know who they want to help. They don't know what they want to help them do. It's all over the place. And that makes it almost impossible to grow no matter how good your content is. That sort of self-clarity on audience and also what you're trying to do and help them is the first thing. Then the next thing aligned with that, number two, would be make sure that everything you create, content, products, services, whatever, is aligned with those things. So if you know you're trying to help this specific audience get this specific thing, everything you do should be aligned to that. Don't then go start talking about some other stuff, because that just creates confusion and et cetera. The third thing is, I would say, and I touched on this a little before, pick one social platform to focus on. Certainly don't try to be everywhere. 2 at most. Maybe you can make an argument that if you're using the second one and you're basically sharing similar stuff, and maybe you can get away with it. Some of this depends on how much time you have. But in general, I would say pick one. Definitely do not try to be everywhere. The one you pick should be based on the one that you most enjoy using just as a regular user. I love Twitter. That's why I'm focused on Twitter. A lot of times I think people assume, oh, I need to be on TikTok because that's the hot thing, or I need to be on Instagram because whatever. But if you don't actually like using those platforms the most, it's probably not going to work as well. And the truth is, any one of these platforms has more than enough people for you to accomplish your goals. So this is hard. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience. Pick the one that you enjoy the most. If you mentioned that you use Twitter and LinkedIn, if you were going to cut down to only one of them, I think you're fine on each. My advice would be, which one do you really like using as a user more? Which community do you feel more a part of, and focus on that? The fourth bit of advice would be, especially when you're starting out, set an output goal, not an outcome goal. So what I mean is, a lot of people I see are like, oh, I need to get 1,000 subscribers this year. And it's like, you're better off saying, I'm going to post 100 episodes or 100 issues or whatever. You want to set an output goal that is completely in your control, that is guaranteed. Audience growth is never in your control. You can influence it, but it's never in your control. Nothing can stop you from an output goal. And that also allows you to start feeling some of the adrenaline boost of success and a win. If my goal was to produce 100 issues and I do it, I'm going to feel good, even if I don't have as big an audience as I want. And it also gives you, depending on how you set the goal, it gives you an opportunity to change directions without feeling like you're quitting or giving up. So if someone said, I'm going to do 20, when I started this podcast, right, in my own mind, I was like, I'm going to do 12 episodes, 1 a week for 3 months. And then I'm going to see where I'm at. And if I decide I don't like doing it, if it doesn't seem worth it, it's easier to walk away. But, you know, you created that moment. A lot of people start stuff with no output commitment. And then from day one, they're like, should I quit? Is it working? Should I go on? What do I do? It's much easier to set an output target, and then you're free to make the decision and not feel like you're giving up. Feel like, oh, I said I was going to do this. I did it. now it's time to do something else. The fifth one, and this is something I've really just realized in the past year or so, I think it's really helpful when it comes to creating stuff to try to come up with a unique twist on a format. So my newsletter only being, there's lots of newsletters about audience and business growth. There's lots of newsletters for creative entrepreneurs. Not a lot of newsletters are a sentence or a paragraph. So that little thing, and that's not going to be for everyone, but it's going to make me stand out. It's unique. It's not all, you see a lot of newsletters that all feel the same. You see a lot of podcasts or listen to a lot of podcasts that all feel the same. And the same thing when I was coming up with this podcast, it was like, I wanted something that was a little unique. There's a million shows with people bringing guests on and interviewing them. I was like, let's flip it. I want to have people come on and ask me the question. It always bugged me that in podcasts, there was so much what I call fluff. There was so much, tell me about yourselves. When I do this podcast, I have the guests like, we're going to do a 3-sentence intro. We're going to do 3 questions that you've sent me in advance because I want to give, how do I give people as much value per minute as possible? And those are things that do that. That has created a somewhat unique format, which helps it stand out. So I think for people just starting out, no matter what it is you're going to do, if you can find a little twist or something unique on it that helps you stand out, I think that can help in a lot of ways. Number 6, build relationships. I think most people overlook how important relationships are, both with your audience and with other creators. Those relationships are gold in terms of growth tactics. Even people that don't have huge, obviously people that have big audiences, but even if they don't, other people that are starting out when you are, and having your audience feel like they know you and you know them. The better you know them, the better you're going to be able to serve them. The better they feel like they know you, the more they're going to care and the more invested they are going to be in you. It's funny. Lots of people will ask me, how do I get more followers? No one really asks me, how do I build better relationships? One good relationship can grow your audience more than almost anything that you could do. So build relationships. The next one, the 7th one, I would say this is for people that struggle sometimes figuring out what kind of content to create or that alignment with, okay, they know what they want, but they're not sure what to do to get there. I think a really helpful exercise is write a list of 50 questions or challenges that your target audience has. Your answers to those questions are all content. So your podcast, for example, right? You could write down a list, your target audience. You go, I'm going to write down 50 questions that I think my target audience has. Every episode is going to address, and it doesn't have to be, hey, here's today's question, right? It can be in the background. You could be like, oh, I want to talk about how to raise money or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be, today's episode is question 3, how to raise money. No, it could be, how could I help people figure out how to raise money? Oh, I could do an episode with this guy who's an expert, do an episode where I tell my story. So it gives you an alignment for infinite content. So you should never struggle for ideas. And the other thing is if you struggle to come up with 50 questions or challenges that your target audience would have, you probably don't know them well enough or it's not a good target audience or you don't know what their transformation is. So that's another sort of very tactical tip. The 8th one, and we talked about this a little before, be patient and realistic. It's going to take time. I say to people with newsletters all the time, newsletters don't go viral. I don't care how great your newsletter is. You're not getting 1 million subscribers overnight. So I think going into it with those realistic expectations of I have a long-term view. Yes, I want to be making progress, but this is not going to be like an overnight thing is important. Number 9, and this one always is interesting to me. Invest in yourself. If possible, spend money to grow and learn. It's interesting when I talked about those growth tactics, I said I ran Facebook ads, I ran newsletter ads. It's amazing to me how many people will invest 100 hours of their time into creating something and then won't spend $100 to get people to see it. Like, I think you owe it to yourself if you can afford it. And I'm not talking about millions and thousands of dollars, right? I'm saying, if you wrote a blog post and you're not willing to spend $10 to promote it on Facebook, that's a problem. It just is. And that also can extend to learning and buying courses or coaches or consultants or whatever. There's a lot of different ways to invest in what you're doing, but I think that investment is important. And then the last thing, again, kind of comes full circle. I said it before, have a newsletter. Even if it's really simple, email is the strongest connection you can have to your audience. I actually think anyone's main audience growth goal should be to grow that list because it's the most reliable way to reach people with anything. Even if your email subscriber is better than a YouTube subscriber, even if you have a YouTube channel. Same thing with podcasts. Like, I think that should be a core of what you're doing, and understanding that when people do see your content, you want to give them a reason to give you your email and get that connection so that you can reach. It's a lot of times people will just start a newsletter and it's this thing over here. Well, that thing over there needs you to drive people back to it. So I think if you're just starting out and you try to do those 10 things, or even some of those 10 things, they'll help you along the right path. And I think more importantly, help you get through what is a tough go of it initially. That perseverance, it's going to be hard and it's going to be slow, and you're going to wonder if it's going in the right direction. And hopefully those things help. Any questions about any of that?
I'm curious because you mentioned, I think it was number 9, about spending a little bit of money to get eyeballs on your content. Do you think that might actually, I guess, kind of attract not your your target audience? Because so if you're running a paid ad and you're paying, let's say, a few $100 to get people to subscribe to your newsletter, are you worried that won't be the quality of the audience won't be strong versus if someone comes through you through Twitter, for example, when they've already had a relationship with you on Twitter, so they know what to expect from you, but kind of a colder paid ad acquisition campaign might seem a little more, I don't know, rushed or just a little forced. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, so here's the key. The key is it's funny because you're actually talking about two separate things. So one is the decision to invest money in growing your audience, let's say. Mm-hmm. So you have a podcast. So the first question is, am I going to spend any money to grow my podcast? That's one separate decision. If you decide, yes, spending money to grow my podcast audience makes sense, I'm going to spend $200. Now, the next question is, what's the best use of the $200 I'm going to spend to grow my podcast? And that's where you can brainstorm and ultimately experiment, but brainstorm a ton of different options. So, for example, when I promote my newsletter, I'm doing it very specifically to the right types of audiences who are going to like it. They can see what my newsletter is. I'm never doing a thing where I'm never tricking people into subscribing. I'm never buying lists of email addresses or any of that shady stuff. What I'm doing is I'm paying to expose it to people who I think are going to like it. Mm-hmm. And there's a million different ways to do that. And it depends on what the product is and what the audience is, all that kind of stuff. So if you do it right and do it effectively, and you can also measure that, right? You can go, hey, I ran this ad here. And especially with newsletters, podcasts, it gets a little murkier. It's a little trickier, but I can, with a newsletter, go, okay, 20 people subscribed that saw it on that guy's website from that ad I ran, and 19 of them unsubscribed 2 weeks later. That was not worth it. Or 20 of them subscribed and 2 weeks later, they're all there. So newsletters give you a little better metrics than podcasts. But even with podcasts, there's a version of that, right? You could create a page on your website that has some sort of, do you want this best of clip or whatever, something that allows people to opt in and then judge. So I think that's the separate question there is it worth investing? And now how do I get whatever is the best thing that I want from that? You might find it's something completely different, right? You might go, you know what? I'm going to sponsor other podcasts. You might go, okay, well, here's a show that has the exact audience I want, that kind of thing. But that's how I would think about it. A lot of people they don't even get to what's the best use of this money because they're just, I don't have money to promote my blog posts, which is, by the way, which is fine. Maybe they don't. And if they don't, then that's a separate question of, well, it'll just take longer. I see all these things as sliding scales. Money, let me see if I can remember this because it's been a while since I talked about this. Money, time, and effort are all sliding scales. The more money you have to invest in growing something, the less time and effort you need. The more time you have, the less money and effort you need. The more effort you have, the less time and money. So everybody has those three scales and people have different things that they can play with, right? Like, for example, you have other stuff to do, so your time is limited. Maybe that means you spend a little more money. And spend money might be promotion, but it also might be hiring someone to help you with something, or someone to edit the podcast, someone to write the newsletter, whatever it is. But that's the way I think about it. When people go, I have no time, I have no effort, and I have no money to put into this, but I still want to grow. It's
Right.
like, I guess it's possible, but you kind of got to do one or more of the three.
That's really interesting. The money, time, and effort, that sliding scale. It's a really good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And it also helps because I think it helps you realize that everybody has, of those three things, has advantages and disadvantages. You having these other businesses, your time is tight. That's a disadvantage. You're going to have less time than me to work on your creator career. But those businesses might also generate money for you,
Right.
which gives you money that you can invest to make up for the lack of time and whatever. So I think it also helps people who feel like, oh, how am I ever going to do this? Everybody usually has, and maybe it's just a willingness to work hard. Some people are just willing to work harder than other people are. It kind of depends. But any last questions before we wrap up here?
No, I think you covered a lot of bases. So thanks so much for all that advice. It's really
Cool.
valuable.
Cool. Thank you.